Good morning, Audrey.
Morning, Doug.
It's nice to see you, and I'm hoping we can have good conversation this morning. What I'd like to do is take you through your life and career path uh, to the extent that what you find relevant to how you got to the place you are now and what you're doing now. And I guess you had an interesting early life, and maybe if you don't mind, we could start there.
My interesting life, I think, begins with my research in Africa. I slid into a PhD program that had a specialization in developing countries at Columbia University. I shouldn't say slid because I was particularly interested. When I entered, I thought I was interested in India, and I had done work on India as an undergraduate, but it turned out in terms of the courses offered, the professors, the seminars, that there was much more of a focus on Africa. So I did work and did a PhD on a group in Nigeria. That group in Nigeria that was involved in a civil war in Nigeria, which was of concern to me. And because I was one of the few scholars who had worked on that community, the people in the US that were supporting that group, the Igbo, turned to me, and I went to Nigeria during the Civil War through the Cameroons, which was not legal, but I did it. Well, it wasn't illegal anyway. It was not what the Nigerian government would have liked. But that kind of solidified my interest in Africa and my interest in vulnerable communities. And
It sounds like that might have been a little dangerous.
well, probably yes, but I was young and foolish.
Right.
And I wasn't married. I didn't have any dependents. When I informed my mother that I was going to go because she was the only one keeping track of me, she said, "Call me if you have a problem," which, of course, was not something I
There were
could
no cell
possibly
phones in
do.
those days,
That's
right?
exactly it.
Right.
So that went fairly well.
Mm.
And when I came back, I wrote a thesis on the Igbo in Nigeria. And I then had my first teaching job, which was at Barnard College. And shortly thereafter, I went back to live in Africa, this time not in Nigeria, but in Ghana. And after a few years in Ghana with a period in the Middle East, in Lebanon in between, I spent 5 years in Kenya. So that period in my life began my work on women who were having problems with development, not getting access to education on an equal basis as young men. And I continued my interest in vulnerable groups.
So I'm wondering what it felt like to go and live. First, you visited Nigeria, but then you went and lived in Ghana, to live in another country that is very different, I assume, from where you grew up, and how you adapted and what you learned from that experience.
Well, I didn't have to adapt quite as much as most people because I was living in a Western house with all kinds of supports. I mean, it still was problematic. And I had my two daughters when I was in Africa,
Wow.
and having a baby in Africa at that point in time was not easy.
Yeah.
Especially one of the children was possibly with serious development problems. It turned out she did not, but it was worrying.
So what lessons did you bring back from this experience? I assume it would influence your decisions about your career going forward and your thinking and reasoning about what's important and what's important to do in the world and so forth.
I think it solidified my commitment to work on vulnerable groups
Yeah.
and to work on inequalities. And my career has really been focused on that.
And after your time in Africa, what did you do when you came back to the United States?
I had a job working for a church agency on peace and justice issues for several years, and did yet another set of degrees. In addition to being trained as a social scientist, I have 2 degrees in theological ethics.
I think many of us sense a sort of ministerial bearing from you. I hope you don't mind me saying that.
I actually am ordained, but I have never served a church on a full-time basis.
That was going to be my next question.
But I have served as a volunteer minister to fill in the church I'm attending on a number of occasions.
And that church, I've forgotten the correct name for it, is
United Church of Christ.
Has a long history of concern about justice and fairness, especially racial and racial equity in the United States. And I know it myself because of the environmental justice movement. I do environmental work, and Charles Lee, who wrote one of the first papers about environmental.
Yes, I work with Charles Lee.
Okay.
He was in the Commission on Racial Justice when I was working for the United Church of Christ. And I work with him, and I work with Ben Chavis on numbers of issues.
Right.
And I met Kareem, my husband. Among my responsibilities was corporate social responsibility. I monitored the portfolios of the national agencies to make sure the corporations in which they were invested were ethical. And I was very interested in the issue of corporations that were selling pesticides, which were illegal in the United States, to countries overseas. And it was because of that that I met Kareem and worked with him for a number of years. And after 5 years of working together, we had a different kind of relationship.
I guess you had a good working relationship then as it progressed further. Well, that's very interesting also. And then what was the path from that to being an academic? I know you as an academic.
Yes.
You're a professor in the department, and that's when I met you. You were in that role, and so, yeah.
I intended to have an academic career. Before I went to Africa for a couple of years in between, I was a professor at Barnard College. When I was in Africa, I taught on a very part-time basis there. When I came back, I looked for an academic job, but could not find one. And that's when I entered into the activist phase of my life, working for the United Church of Christ. When I went from there, I worked for the American Society for the Advancement of Science, which was a job that I found when my job was being moved to Cleveland, and I didn't want to move to Cleveland. And I worked there as the director of a human rights program, which was unusual because it was using science for the benefit of human rights. I pioneered, while I was there, work on economic, social, and cultural rights. And that then eventually led me back to academia.
And did you feel that that work um, had a policy relevance or impact while you were doing it? I think that's their goal.
Yes, that was the goal. The human rights work to protect groups of people who needed protection. But I worked while I was there with numbers of UN agencies as well, particularly those that were working on human rights, and particularly the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. I worked for them as a kind of consultant to do research on various issues.
And then from there, what did you come to UConn next after that?
Yes,
Okay.
after that, I was looking for an academic job and applied for several, and was interviewed here and offered the position. So I was very happy to come.
And how long have you been here? I've forgotten. I should know.
17 years.
Right.
It will be 18 in June, which is a long time.
It is. And what would you say? What would you say is most valuable about being a professor here and the work you do here? And what is it that you bring from your past that you bring into your classes or your writing that makes you a better academic and have more impact?
I love working with students, and that was the major reason I wanted to go back to an academic setting. I have really enjoyed many of the students I've had the opportunity to come to know when I've been here, and it has afforded me a setting in which I can do research on various topics.
So you write books and you teach classes.
I write articles too.
And you write articles too,
Yes.
of course. But books is a little more exceptional. There's less people in the medical school who write books. I write some little books. You write longer ones. But I think what you said about how much you enjoy teaching, I think that's really important. It's hard to be a good teacher, I think, if you don't enjoy it.
Well, I love it.
Yeah.
And when people ask me, well, when do you think you might retire? It's really hard to give up something that means so much to you.
Well, that's great. I know we appreciate having you in that role here. Could you say a little bit about your writing then also, since you've been here? Articles, as you said, and books?
I had done work when I was in my previous job with the American Association for the Advancement of Science on cutting edge scientific issues, many of them dealing with genetics and then stem cells.
Yeah.
So some of my writing has continued to be in that area, but also I have become more and more focused, I think, on economic, social, and cultural rights and vulnerable communities. So the right to health has been a very major focus of my work. And what I'm working on now is a book about how the pandemic has affected vulnerable communities.
Right, and you very generously let me read one of your chapters.
Well, you're one of the few people interested in doing so.
I don't know. There must be others who are interested.
Well, I have some colleagues who've looked at the second chapter, and the first chapter is written now. I'm in the process of just going over the first and second chapters, and then I'm planning to submit it to a publisher and hopefully can get a contract.
Well, I think it's terribly important to sum up the lessons from the pandemic as it was happening. It was just rapid fire decisions, things happening. There was a lot of loud controversy and disagreement and frankly anger that somebody didn't agree with what you agreed with. It was so to have a more thoughtful, and I do think your chapter was very thoughtful,
Thank you.
examination of after the fact. I find that terribly important, frankly.
Well, and I think that there has been controversy about policies. For example, the development of the immunizations and who they went to. But I think there's been much less reflection on the communities that were most affected by the pandemic. So I'm hoping that's what my book will contribute.
You're reminding me of a photograph I saw in the early months of the pandemic. It was on a subway car in Manhattan, and it was packed with people going to work. And it was all the working class and low income people going to their service jobs. And it was such a stark contrast to people like me who could flee and hide away and work remotely, and they had no choice. And that image has stayed with me for a long time. Yeah. So, um, if a younger person, someone who's a student, decided to listen to this and was found your story interesting, what do you think you would tell them that they might take home from your experience and what you did? Are there any broad, sort of generalizable lessons that you think emerge from your
Well,
life and career path?
follow your commitments and take chances.
Yeah, that's great. That's very succinct, but it's so, I agree with that so much. Right.
And also, don't be afraid to change your focus.
Right. Well, I think that's a wonderful place to end this, unless you have something more.
No, I've enjoyed this. Thank you.
Right. And I think if we keep these fairly brief, they're more likely to be viewed more thoroughly. So, Audrey, thank you so much for being the first, as I said in the hallway, the guinea pig. But we'll see what other people think. But I thought we had a nice conversation, and
I did too.
I'm hopeful that I will do more of these with additional faculty, and they will be compare and contrast, and quite a range of different things emerge from them. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome.